realize what the Ark is? It's a transmitter. It's a radio for speaking to God. And it's within my reach.
Just can't seem to fix this hair. I guess you're gonna have to live with it. Hello, boys and girls. I'm back for a jam-packed, much-delayed episode called Evidence of Woo. I actually recorded this episode once before, a long time ago, and the audio was wiped out on the whole thing. I need a different prop. This is too distracting. Let me grab my my epiphany pipe. My IQ goes up at least 20 points when I'm holding a pipe. If I lit it, it would go down like another 15 or so, but I don't have tobacco, so. Anyway, back to what I was saying. I recorded this episode before, weeks ago, and it was an hour and a half long. And all the audio through the whole thing was just, there was just silence. I had tested it before I started the recording. I don't know what happened. But these types of glitches are not unusual. Now, curiously, I've been having audio dropouts plaguing my videos. Contacted the software developer. I've tried different apps. I've shut down extensions on my computer, a variety of different things, trying to troubleshoot this, and have not been able to figure it out. Curiously, when I, maybe I'm speaking too soon, but when I tested this just a little bit ago, to make sure that there was audio, there were no dropouts. And there's also been a significant reduction in woo since I told the spirits that I was taking a break from EVP and that I needed things to calm down for a while. Now, I also mentioned in my previous video that I'm starting to have a new issue, which is that now I'm hearing voices in ambient sounds. That's still continuing a little bit. It's not as bad as it was, but when it happens, man, is it distracting and disconcerting. It happened last night when I was trying to listen to some music. Little 9 Inch Nails, coupled with a little loudmouth spirits or something. Pareidolia, who knows? I'm not going to try and validate this stuff right now while I'm going through all this. But that's actually kind of the point of today's video, was I want to talk about my attempts to validate what was happening. Validation, understanding, debunking, because my point was not to try and confirm that all of these things were real. I didn't know what the hell was happening at the beginning. So it wasn't a matter of confirming it. I was like, I don't even know what is going on here. And then things got weirder and weirder. We'll go through all that. But in this video, I'm going to be showing all kinds of stuff. On the screen, I've got, it's going to be like a multimedia presentation. I've got some audio to include. Potentially some video might be in there. A lot of pictures, screenshots, and things. And this covers everything from what started in 2020. And that was woo. It started with woo. And I talked about this in my other long video about my experiences, because I can't tell you about the evidence for the experiences without talking about the experiences to some degree. So some of this is going to repeat some of that, but I'll try and keep it to a minimum. So kind of consider this a two-parter. Hopefully I can get it all into one video, but I might have to split this into multiple parts depending on how long this is. I do have a tendency to ramble as I'm doing right now. Let's dive right in. So what happened in 2020? As I'd mentioned in the past, I started getting interested in the UFO topic back in 2017 when I saw the New York Times, big cover story about the Pentagon's secret UFO program. And at the time, it was just like, what the hell is this all about? UFOs? Now, I'd seen a UFO a couple times when I was a kid, but, you see a light in the sky and you're like, I don't know what that was. I can't explain that. And I'd had some weird experiences when I was a kid. But they were always the kind of things where you just kind of go, I don't really know how to categorize this. And so I'm just going to set it aside. Because that's all you can do with that kind of stuff. And in some cases, your brain will actually take that stuff and compartmentalize it for you. And this is sort of a well-known thing, particularly with UFO sightings or contact. Nobody really knows exactly what's happening there. Is it the brain doing that? Is it the phenomenon that's doing that? You'll often hear about it in cases where more than one person is involved. So, for example, I just saw a case on Reddit. There were 3 people who claimed that they were out hunting and they saw a square UFO off in the distance. A cube UFO moving around. Now, of course, what they saw with their naked eye was very different than what they caught on their smartphone, where it's just, basically 4 pixels that look a little odd. The interesting part was not what they saw, but their reaction to it, which was that they all immediately forgot it had happened. And the guy said he was only reminded when he was going through his videos and he went, oh my God, that's right. We all saw an inexplicable object. And then it was like it was just wiped from our memory. And that kind of thing you hear about over and over again. When I was going through all of my stuff in retrospect, trying to go back and go, is this a new phenomenon that was going on with me, or was this something that was going on in the past? Some things I was able to dredge up, and other things kind of unlocked as I was experiencing new things, or something would remind me of it, or someone would say something, I'd be like, oh my God, how could I have completely forgotten about that? But I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. 2017, the New York Times story, I became obsessed with UFOs. That's also not uncommon for people who end up believing that they've had contact experiences. They go through a period before they become aware of it where they are completely obsessed with UFOs. Now, I have kind of a tendency for obsession anyway. My therapist has said there's a little bit of OCD tendency in there. Nothing dramatic, but when I get interested in a subject, I get really interested in the subject. And this is also not uncommon with people who have ADHD. Some people put letters after their name like PhD or MD. Mine are more like PTSD, ADHD, OCD. I need some new business cards. That's what I need. Wow, this is going to be one of those videos. So buckle up, kids. It's going to be a long one. So my obsession involved my devouring everything I could find on the topic. Now, when I investigate things, I start by going to the most credible sources first. First-hand accounts when I can find them, scientific research when it's available, unbiased sources as much as you can find them. Those are the things that I tend to focus on. Now, of course, when you're investigating UFOs, one of the things that inevitably comes up is abduction. And I always avoided that stuff. It was too weird. I'd read some abduction accounts from people and went, this is insane. This doesn't make any sense. Rationally, you can just pick this stuff apart in moments. Why would anyone believe this stuff? And I ignored it. But the UFO stuff, man, there was so much evidence in there supporting it. Now, as I said, I had seen a UFO when I was a kid. It was off in the distance. I was living in Santa Fe at the time, and this would have been in the mid-'80s. And we were on the northern side of town, kind of up in the hills a little bit, if you know Santa Fe at all. So we had a great view in the distance of the lights of the city, and then way off in the distance was Albuquerque. And you couldn't see it because it's so far away. Maybe a glow on the horizon from the city. And this light was off in that direction. Now, there's an airport in Albuquerque. It was myself and my dad that witnessed this. And so, of course, that was one of the things we talked about. Could it be from the airport? There's also an airport in Santa Fe, a small airport. And so we were like, could this light be from a plane? So the way it was behaving was there was this bright white light, and it was stationary in the sky, and then it would kind of move down, and then it would stay there for a while, and then it would move back up again, and then it would stay there for a while. So, of course, my dad and I were like, Could these be potentially like landing lights on a plane? Because if the runway is aligned in such a way that it was coming straight towards us, we might see the plane coming in for a landing, coming down, da-da-da, and then taking off again. So this was going on long enough that my dad went in to get a pair of binoculars, and we were, trading them back and forth, and we were watching it. While neither of us was looking through the binoculars, just looking off at the light, it went up and to the right, and it was gone. And there were no more lights in the spot where we were seeing it. So it did not appear to be a plane. But, I was like, did you see it? My dad said, yeah, he saw it. UFO, right? I mean, what else could it have been? 2 witnesses. It wasn't a hallucination. It was not a satellite. There were no drones back then. But, you see a light in the sky, it doesn't change your life, typically. And this one didn't at the time. There were other weird experiences that happened when I was a kid. And I talked about some of them in my other videos, so I'll just direct you there rather than repeating them all here. But this one seemed important, the UFO. So I was open to the idea of UFOs, at least, and I was finding all this credible evidence about it. It doesn't take long to run out of stories about UFOs. Like, there's only so many cases out there. Then there was the stuff from the Nimitz, although much of that didn't really come out until later. And so you start to branch out a little bit, I was listening to podcasts on related subjects. One of my favorites at the time was Mysterious Universe podcast, which if you haven't listened to that one, I highly recommend it. It's fascinating stuff. And the thing I like about it is that the hosts just recount the cases and they don't typically weigh in on judging them in any way. It's just sort of like, here's a new interesting thing that has happened. And so I was listening to those. I ended up listening to a podcast that was an interview with Leslie Kean. Now, she was one of the reporters in the New York Times story, but she had just come out with a new book called Surviving Death. And it was talking about, well, she's got a Netflix series. And if you haven't watched that, I highly recommend that as well. Check out the Surviving Death series. It's really good. As a matter of fact, it also has a section in there where they talk about mediums, and it's great because it makes the mediums look bad at their job. And that's what I like about it. It was like they didn't opt to leave it out because it didn't have great results, as a matter of fact. And I'm not disparaging the medium. It was just the way the things happened, it didn't make the medium look good. I had no experience with mediumship or anything at that point. So I was like, yeah, well, that's kind of weird. That's not in line with Leslie's book. Because I read the book first. The stuff she was talking about in the book was fascinating because Leslie Kean, is a reporter, an investigative journalist for the New York Times. She's got her chops, right? She knows how to investigate things and validate them and verify them and everything else because her editors require it. If they're going to publish something, they have to be confident that they're not going to later have to retract a story. So they make sure that people have really checked their sources first. And so I have some good respect for Leslie Kean in that regard. And this was before I read the book. I just listened to the podcast. But Leslie Kean was talking about, all of the work that she did and trying to validate these mediums she was working with and the things she experienced at seances and everything else. And I'm a very curious, investigative person myself. As you know, if you've watched any of the stuff on my channel, I want to try things for myself. I don't just want to take other people's word for it. I'm like, let's give it a shot and see how it goes. One night as I was getting into bed, I remember just being like, there are any spirits here? Make a loud sound to let me know that you're here. I waited for a while, and of course, nothing happened. Then, as I was falling asleep, I heard a loud crash in the house. I have 2 very excellent biosensors in the form of cats. These cats sleep on my bed. And through so much of what has happened since 2020, the cats have helped me know that things were not hallucinations because they responded to them. And the cats responded to this crashing noise. And so I got out of bed and I went through the house and I tried to find, because this was a loud crash, what the heck made the sound? And I could not find anything out of place. The next day, I went outside and I got up and looked on the roof to see if maybe a big branch had fallen down off a tree and landed on the roof, and there was nothing there. I could never determine what the source of the noise was, but it was ambiguous. I don't know what this is. So a few nights later, I said to the spirits, that was kind of ambiguous. Instead of just making a loud noise, if you're here, could you communicate by knocking 3 times? And then I'll know that you're here. And I waited for a while, and there were no knocks. So as I was falling asleep, I heard in my left ear, which was the ear against the pillow, dum-dum-dum, a hypnagogic hallucination. But it was an odd hallucination, because it kind of kept in line with my request to hear spirits. But it was certainly not evidence of spirits. I was just like, well, that was curious. And I just sort of set it aside. Now, another thing that happened right around that time was I've talked about a bunch of stuff in my other video, for which a lot of it, I don't have any evidence to back it up. In other words, and I'm not saying that that means it's like it wasn't true. I'm just saying that there's no way to validate some of these things. I experienced some things, a lot of different things, for which I have no evidence. They happened in childhood, they, happened, couldn't take a camera or whatever. I'm going to try and focus on this video only on the stuff for which I have some evidence. Now, varying degrees of evidence, none of this is scientifically valid, right? It was not collected under controlled laboratory conditions. I don't have eyewitnesses, and none of that stuff. This is not intended to make you a believer in the phenomenon, but what I do want you to see is that not everybody who comes to believe crazy things like I may have been abducted by aliens comes from a just like an insane position where they read an article and went, oh, that sounds cool. I think that happened to me. So a lot of people will go to the experiencers subreddit, particularly the skeptics or the people who've had no personal experiences, and they see posts and they comment elsewhere and they go, those people are crazy, because they will have the mildest thing happen and they wonder whether they should be attributing it to aliens. Like, how are they making the leap from I get a weird mark on my arm to aliens may have abducted me? And they think that people are just, they get a weird mark and they think that, this is a perfectly reasonable possibility. In most cases, that's not what's going on. What's happening is that there's a lot of other stuff that has happened to this person. They have a history of experiences that defy rational explanation. And so they're more open to the idea that some things are not so easily explained, or that things that you can easily explain doesn't necessarily mean that those are the right explanations. You can see this a lot on the Skinwalker Ranch TV show. Now, if you're not familiar with Skinwalker Ranch, if you haven't read any of the books, or you haven't done any of the research, or watched any of the interviews with the people involved in the show, the researchers, the scientists, you don't know their backgrounds, you can watch the show and go, this is preposterous. Like, Travis Taylor. How can Travis Taylor say the rocket moved funny in the sky? It's probably a portal to another world. Well, Travis didn't look at the rocket and then that was his conclusion. Travis Taylor has been involved in UAP research for years. He has access to a tremendous amount of, or has had, classified data. He's talked to some of the best minds in our government who are investigating UAP, who have access to different sets of classified data. Travis Taylor has an awareness that there is this phenomenon that exists, that consists of all these different things, and he knows that that is genuine. So for him, it is not a big leap to go from there's something in the sky that's behaving in a very, very weird way. Maybe it's a portal, or whatever he might think at the time. So he's not making these giant leaps, and I would like to say that in my experience, most experiencers aren't either. They're rational people, they're sane people, and research done by psychiatrists and psychologists and people who've investigated the UAP phenomenon, the contact phenomenon, from a skeptical perspective, will say that experiencers tend to actually have lower incidence of mental illness versus the population. Now, what they're talking about are, psychosis, delusions, schizophrenia. The research does note that these people have higher incidence of PTSD, for one, depression, for another, and one of the big ones that they love to focus on is they're fantasy prone. Now, I'd like to give you my personal explanation for why these people are fantasy prone. Because the experiences aren't typically limited to, I had one incident where beings were in my room, and then I remember being on a ship and medical experiments or whatever, and then I was back in my bed. It's usually accompanied by precognitive dreams, psi phenomenon of various types, inexplicable paranormal phenomenon like objects disappearing and reappearing in other places. And I say inexplicable because I'm talking about the ones that you can't easily explain. You can't rationally explain them. And I've got an example, although it's not one I have evidence for, so I'll just mention it real quick. I have a box right here that I had a lock on it, and I had the key sitting on top of the box, and the key disappeared, and I couldn't find it anywhere. And then I had this weird thought, because all of this other bizarre stuff was happening. What if the key is in the box? And so I rattled the box, and there was something in it. There shouldn't have been anything in it. It was this cheapo little antique padlock. And so I picked the lock on it and opened it up, and sure enough, the key was inside the box. Now, it's not proof of anything, but my belief is that it was an apward. In other words, an object disappearing in one place and reappearing in another, which is very well documented in paranormal research, believe it or not. Grant Cameron just recently put out a whole book about this topic. It's an example of the kind of weird things that happen to people. So that's how you end up fantasy prone. Because all of this other stuff is going on that is considered to be inexplicable by materialist science. And the people are like, well, I can't explain this, and an awful lot of it has been going on, and it's been going on for most of my life or whatever. And so they end up being marked as fantasy prone. And so the researchers are like, oh, well, that's probably one of the contributing factors to them thinking they've been abducted by aliens. And undoubtedly, it plays a part. These are not simple things to tease out. And I really want to emphasize that. There's no firm conclusions on any of this. With all of my experiences, I don't know what happened. Was I abducted by aliens? I don't know. I'm going to give you some of the evidence for that. Did I practice remote viewing? I think so. Can't be positive. Have I had incidents of mediumship? I'm less confident in that than the other stuff, but I'm more confident now after having my experiences with EVP. Even the EVP, what is that? Am I confident that I was talking to spirits? No, I am not confident I was talking to spirits. I'm more confident I was talking to something. I'm also wide open to the possibility that it was some type of psychokinesis something, a psi phenomenon that did not necessarily involve external consciousness. I think it's less likely based on everything that happened to me and research that's been done by other people, but I don't know for sure. And I'm not here to persuade you that these things are real. I'm not expecting any of the stuff that I'm going to show you to be your proof. It's not a smoking gun, but you'll see the level of attention that I put into trying to understand what was happening. And so it all started in 2020. So where this started, honestly, I wasn't documenting it at that time because I had no reason to. They were just weird, odd things that were happening. And they would have been probably mostly termed as synchronicities, which are incredibly unlikely coincidences that seem to be related to each other. Sometimes it'll be connected to something that you're thinking about. Jacques Vallée has a theory that the universe is structured based around information, and that it's sort of like a search index, that when you start thinking about something, the universe will then start presenting other things to you that are related to that. And so I was having increasingly unlikely things happening. Like the first time I used the tarot deck for myself, I had used it to do readings for some other people. First time I tried to do it for myself, I drew the same card 4 times in a row. And the odds of that happening are roughly 1 in 476,000. It's not proof of anything, but it was weird, right? It was unlikely. And those kinds of things kept happening. Now, there's an app that's been released by Russell Targ. Targ and Pudov were the 2 scientists who were researching remote viewing for the CIA. They developed the entire remote viewing program and did it for, 20 plus years of investigating this. Russell Targ released an app, which you can download to your smartphone, and it's a Psi app. Psi being just another term for ESP. And the way it works is you've got 4 squares, and one of them is the correct choice. Tap that one, it'll play a pleasant sound, and then you get a nice image of a nature scene. And they did it this way because these types of reinforcement have been shown to produce better results. And so I was playing around with this app because at this point I was researching all of these various things because I was trying to understand what was happening to me. And keep in mind, I'm only talking here, I'm not. Watch my other video if you want me to be talking about the things I was experiencing. Here, I'm only trying to focus on the stuff where I've got the evidence for it. So I was playing around with the Psi app. Statistically, you're going to average out 1 in 4 chance you should get 25% correct. Sometimes you'll get more than that. Sometimes you'll get less than that. But as I was playing with the app, I was consistently getting higher than 25%. And sometimes I was getting approaching 50% accuracy. And it was happening over and over again. And I was playing around with the app, and I was noticing if I go as fast as I can without thinking about what I'm tapping on, I frequently score significantly higher than 25%. Here's an example of that. And you can watch here, I go through several runs of the app back to back. Now, not all of them are dramatic, but you'll note that the majority of them, I scored higher than 25%. Now, that's indicative of Psi. It's not proof, but it certainly was curious. And so when it continued to happen, I took some screenshots. And I tried some experiments where I was keeping track for a while. I was writing down as I was doing this, keeping like a journal, and I was writing down like how good am I doing versus chance. And I started off well, and then it just kind of tapered off after a while. That's actually keeping in line with the research with remote viewing. What they often found was that there's a beginner's luck, where people do much better at it at first, and then it just sort of declines after a while. And they had this happen with remote viewers as well, who would initially have phenomenal capability, and then over time it would just diminish, and then they would do no better than anybody, no better than chance, I would say. Because when I say no better than anybody else, everybody seems to be able to do this to some degree, and it's complicated. So I was playing around with that for a while until it started tapering off. And then I started to experience what's called Psi Missing. I was playing around with it, and I started scoring significantly worse than chance. Repeatedly. The whole concept of Psi Missing is that you're still utilizing Psi. Your brain still has an idea of what the right answers are, but for whatever subconscious reason, it's giving you the wrong answer. And my suspicion is that this was because my hyper-rational brain was trying to tell me, look, like, this stuff is too weird. You need to, like, calm down, and we're just going to sort of discredit this. I was getting these unusual results. I was like, what else could I do with this? How else could I play around with this? And I'd been experimenting with the tarot and getting results that seemed unusually significant. Now, the thing about the tarot is that, well, like reading your horoscope, is it written so vaguely, there's usually something that kind of matches up. And so I was like, well, maybe this is just my brain trying to find patterns where there aren't any. This is called apophenia. Your brain naturally looks for patterns in things, probably some survival mechanism. So I was like, you know what I'll do is I'll create an account and I'll go on Reddit and I'll just offer free tarot readings to other people and I'll ask them, does this seem significant to you? Now I know that, people are more biased, especially the people who are going to the type of subreddit where you're going to get a tarot reading. But it was more information. I wasn't sure how else I could get information on this at this point, and I just wanted more data. So I created this account, and the first time I went to do a tarot reading for somebody, I did the reading, I asked him how it went, he kind of explained it to me, and I was like, meh, I was not as impressed with it as he was. But then I had this, tickling in my head. I said to the guy, do you know what remote viewing is? And he said, yeah, I've heard of it. I said, do you mind if I try remote viewing? Now, keep in mind, I barely knew what remote viewing was myself. As a matter of fact, what I did doesn't really qualify as remote viewing at all under the definition. What happened, though, was pretty strong evidence of clairvoyance. So I was like, here's what I see. I see you're on a low bed, low to the ground. There's an animal next to you. I think it's a dog, but it might be a cat. And I see art, and it looks like this. And you can read the descriptions, because I'm putting it up on the screen here for you. In case you can't read it or you don't want to look at it, I'll just tell you. I described all these things in the layout of the room. And a separate scene that I saw, which was, a cart covered with plants sitting right in front of a window, and named some of the plants on it. And he came back and he said, oh my God, this is almost entirely accurate to my bedroom and where I'm at right now while I'm reading this, including the cat being on the bed next to him. He said it was a cat, but the cat behaved like a dog. And then he came back just a moment later and said, oh, I actually misread part of this. It's actually 100% accurate. You got literally every single thing correct. None of it was wrong. Now, I was like, that seems statistically unlikely. But how do you quantify something like that? How do you know what are the odds of this? So what I did was I thought about every bedroom I've ever been in, that I've lived in, or bedroom that I've had, I should say, and bedrooms of all of the people that I've known, and was like, how many of the features that I gave matched up to those rooms? And it was like, hardly any of them. So right away, I had an indication that something really weird was going on here. So I got very excited. I was like, I'm going to read more about remote viewing. How do you do remote viewing? And I found a class on YouTube that was given by a woman named Prudence Calabrese. And she had also done some work for the CIA. I linked to this in the show notes. I highly recommend that everybody give this a try. It's on YouTube, at least it is for now. Chances are at some point it's going to get pulled, everything else does. And it's a series of classes. They're free, and she talks you through it step by step. It was an actual class that they were doing, and they just happened to have a camera there. And so I watched the first episode of this and tried it and went, okay, the results I got once again from, just within the video seemed oddly accurate. And so I asked my sister, hey, would you mind setting up a scene for me or picking an object or something? And I'm going to try and remote view it right now based on what I just learned from, one episode of this class. And so she said, okay, I've got something. So I sat down and I wrote out my notes. I was closing my eyes and I was trying to see something, and I kept seeing an image of a whale, like the tail of a whale. But I knew that you're not supposed to take exactly what you see and write that down. It's what they call an analytical overlay, because remote viewing tends to work in a symbolic way. for whatever reason. Maybe that's the way information is organized in the universe. Don't know. This has definitely been confirmed that remote viewing works in a very symbolic fashion typically. So they tell people, for example, if you're seeing like a green car, you don't put down green car, you put down green or wheels or movement, something like that. You break it down into the component parts. But I was like, I feel like the shape of this thing, so I drew kind of a whale shape, but I was like, I don't know, it really feels like a whale. So I wrote whale, ? And then I was seeing a mountain range, and I kind of drew the shape of the mountains, and then I wrote mountains, ? And this was on a little notepad. And I went around the paper and I just drew some other shapes and things that I would, senses of what I was getting. There's this box with lines radiating out of it, a kind of a grid pattern, a rectangle, like a square or something, but not dead on. I put these in various parts of the page, and then I sent it to my sister, and she sent back the picture. And it turned out what it was a water bottle, and on the water bottle is a picture of a dolphin jumping out of the water, and behind it is a mountain range. And it's sitting on top of a loudspeaker, which is shaped like a cube, and I had drawn a cube with lines radiating out of it, like sound coming out of it. To the left of this was a pane of glass that was leaning up against it, and I had drawn a rectangle over here. Up above, the top of the water bottle was this round shape, and I had drawn sort of a blobby, roundish shape up above it. Did I get it exact? No. Would this have matched up with any other random object? No. Heck no. I definitely felt I was onto something with this. And so I continued to play around with it and explore it. Finally got to a reading that I did where I, once again, I asked my sister to pick a place, anywhere on the planet. Just pick a place. That was all the instruction I gave her. And then I sat down and I did my remote viewing, and I'd watched a few more classes at this point. I think I made it through like 3 or 4 out of like 14 videos or something. What you do is you interrogate the object multiple times. In other words, you do a reading and you focus on whatever this thing is and you write down everything you can get from it, and then you stop and then you do it again. And you interrogate it multiple times, and you'll end up getting more and more various like parts of the big picture. So the first thing I got was a bridge, and I wrote down everything that I was sensing about it, even the things that didn't seem like they made any sense. I just wrote them down. Descriptors. But I also, at the end of it, you do the descriptors, and then at the end you kind of draw, if you got any shapes or whatever, put them down. So I did that, and I drew a bridge with these little arches under it. And then in the next one, I was getting this sense of like a waterfall and a kind of a swampy smell and things. Now, in my mind, I'm going, a swamp doesn't really have anything to do with a bridge. How are these things connected? And so I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to be like, these things aren't related. But I was like, no, stick with it. Just go with it. Write it down. Doesn't matter if you're right or you're wrong. Just let's see how it goes. And so I wrote all that down. And then on the last one, I was getting it, and I had this strong sense of a building. And as I was writing down the descriptors, I started becoming more confident that what I was seeing was either the Space Needle in Seattle or the Eiffel Tower. I've never been to either one, but I have a general vague idea of what they look like. So I felt like it was one or the other of those. But I was trying to, like, not do the analytical overlay thing. So I was like, draw a sense of what I'm getting. And so I sort of mixed the two together. And I made kind of like an Eiffel Tower with the Space Needle dome thing on the top. And then I asked my sister, what was the scene? And she said, it's the Eiffel Tower. And I was like, well, did you have a photo? And she said, no, I just picked the Eiffel Tower. So I went and I looked up pictures of the Eiffel Tower. And lo and behold, there's right next to it is a bridge. And the bridge has the exact same arches under it, the same number of arches under it. the things that I wrote down describing the Eiffel Tower, something, when I added them up, it was somewhere like 70 to 80% of them were accurate, or were accurate at one point, like it had been painted at one point, but then the paint, it's been now painted a different color. But I was confused by the swampy waterfall thing. And then I read that there was actually like a little lagoon area under the Eiffel Tower, and there's a waterfall, and it's like a little swampy area. And so every single aspect of this thing I got right. Not every single detail, but the major aspects were all right. Now, what are the odds of that? All I told my sister was pick a place on the planet. If you ask anyone, pick a place on the planet, what are they going to pick? The pyramids, maybe the Colosseum, the seven wonders of the world kind of thing. I might have been able to get it was the Eiffel Tower, right? But I've never been to the Eiffel Tower. I don't know what the Eiffel Tower consists of. I didn't know there was a swamp under it. I didn't know all of these minor details that it turned out I'd gotten correct. I certainly didn't know there was a bridge. So at this point I went, okay, I can't deny this. What I do know is that I decided not to do remote viewing again. And I'll tell you why. Because my rational brain was fighting me tooth and nail through this process, because I was resisting ontological shock, is what was going on subconsciously. Like every step along the way, I was getting these, arguments in my head with cognitive dissonance and everything else, being like, this is real. No, it's not, and like fighting in my head. And I knew from what had happened with my experiments with doing this, just the simple size stuff, that if it got to the point where I started not doing well, my brain was going to take it and try and persuade me that it was evidence that it was all a giant coincidence. It's a tough thing to push your way past this. It really, really is. And so I'm contacting researchers, as I said, other remote viewers, people who've done experiments, and high-level people. And I'm not going to give their names out. It's not fair to them. But you'd know the names of all of these people. That any one of them that I mentioned, they've written a book, they've published papers, they're, heads of organizations, they were lead research subjects, whatever it is, you would know these people. Almost all of them. And I'm writing to them and I'm going, this is what's happening. Can you explain it to me? Typically what I was hearing back was, well, this part of that is very, very normal. The fact that you're experiencing all of these things at the same time, it's unusual. And so I started being like, oh, maybe I'm delusional. Like maybe I'm really losing my mind here. I'm in therapy, and I see both a therapist and a psychiatrist. Now, my therapist is not into the woo, and neither is my psychiatrist. I was not into the woo when I started seeing these people. I also believe that if you're seeing a mental health professional, you tell them what is happening. You don't lie to them. You don't hold back. They're there to help you. And I was really struggling. And I was telling my therapist everything that was going on through this process. I'll just say that where we're at right now, my therapist has come to believe that some of these things are true. She's admitted this to me. She's told me, she's given me permission to talk about it. I'm not going to give her name. But she's acknowledged that I've helped to shift her beliefs, and a lot of it was based on the amount of research that I was doing and the evidence that I was just presenting her simply by talking about what was happening and what I was doing to try and understand it. And the rational analysis that I was putting into analyzing these things to come up with, okay, well, if it was this, then this or this. And if it was this, then this or this, right? What if it was prosaic? What would the odds of that be? What would that look like? What is the evidence for it or against it? What if it was not prosaic? What would the evidence be for it, against it? All of these things. I was trying to get understanding. I wanted to know the truth. I didn't want to persuade myself that it was real if it wasn't, or the other way around. So I continued to play around with that only up until the point where I was like, I can't get any more out of this without it just starting to mess with my head. And then I would stop and move on to the next thing. So one of the reasons that I have a therapist is I've got incredibly bad ADHD. One of the things that happens with that, or at least I used to attribute it to my ADHD, is I would get these days where they're noisy brain days. That's how I used to describe it to my ex. I said it was like 100 radios and they're all playing at the same time, and you can't hear any one of them. And it was like that. When I get these noisy days, I can't focus in on anything. But sometimes these days it really was like they were radio stations, like I was hearing talking. And so I'm exploring all of these concepts of psi and telepathy and remote viewing and clairaudience and clairvoyance. And I had one of these noisy days and it kind of sounded like talking. And I went, what if it really was talking? How would I figure that out? I decided, when I was having one of these noisy days that I was going to try meditating and focusing, instead of trying to ignore this stuff and shut it out, I was going to focus in on it and kind of ask questions. I was getting all of this sort of chatter. I couldn't understand any of it, right? So I did this, and I asked for a name and a place, and then any other piece of information that would help me identify this. And I got a name, and I wrote it down. I got a place, I wrote it down. And then I got this piece of information. So what I got was Holbrook Baptist Church. I was like, I don't know what that's about, but I'll write it down. And I thought, okay, that's enough information. I'll head to Google. And so I did. And I got, well, the first thing is that there were very few hits on the name. It was a kind of an unusual name. And I'd love to put the name out there, but this person is still alive, as far as I know. And the last thing I want to do is just be like doxing somebody online, so I'm not going to do that. I wish I could. But I searched for the name, I searched for the place. Now, those two things didn't match up. I will say that. That was not accurate. But the Holbrook Baptist Church, there was only one hit that came up at the time. Now, Google is always getting new information and adding things to their index, and if you search for it now, you get more hits than you did when I did this in 2020. At the time that I did it, there was only one hit that came up for a Holbrook Baptist Church. It was no longer in existence. It had been in existence for like 8 years or something. Back in the 80s, I think it was. At this specific location, which is still a church, but not Holbrook Baptist anymore. It was a very unusual name for this person. And there were only a few hits, but one of the hits was literally an 8-minute drive from where he lives to the Holbrook Baptist Church. Now, again, how do you calculate the statistical odds on that? I have no idea, but the name was not John Smith. It was unusual enough that I ended up getting, I think it was 3 results for the name, and that was it. For the entire US, 3 results. And one of them was 8 minutes from the church that I had been given the specific name of which there was only one. I have no idea how to calculate the odds on that. But they've got to be pretty far out there, I would think. I don't know what it meant, because was it mediumship? No, because this person appears to still be alive, or at least they were when I did the reading. They didn't seem to have any connection to the church, as far as I could tell, at least not that came up on Google. I don't know what was happening here. Now, some of the experts that I contacted suggested that I was effectively like a badly tuned radio, and that I'm just pulling in information from anywhere, that I've got a very strong receiver, effectively, but a really crappy tuner. So rather than getting just the station I want, I'm getting all of this information that comes in, particularly on days when I'm tired or whatever and I'm not feeling well. And I say tired specifically because for as long as I can remember, shortly before I start falling asleep, I hear voices. And I was like, well, this is just standard hypnagogic hallucination stuff. And I still don't know if that's the case, because some of the, I mean, just within the past, like, week and a half, now I've started hearing voices when I'm not doing EVP sessions that are related to the EVP sessions that appear to be providing some veridical information. And so I don't know what is going on there. I'm not trying to validate that right now. I'm trying to take a break from all that, because I need to be careful with my psyche. I don't want to, smash it into bits. And this is a lot to be trying to understand and deal with, because this is not normal stuff, right? I can't, even my therapist is having a hard time keeping up with this. It's not psychosis. It's not delusion, but it's got some common traits with that. And so, because I don't know what I'm dealing with, I'm just being cautious. But there's evidence that I'm picking stuff up that I don't know why. Now, when I did the EVP work, I was told by the other people who were doing the EVP work that I was contacting. And some of these people, again, are researchers, people who were very heavily involved with organizations that, I'm trying not to drag people's names out without their permission. And what they were telling me was that my results are incredibly aberrant. One of them accused me of lying, honestly, because he said the claims that I was making were ludicrous, that nobody gets as much content out of EVP as I was claiming I was getting. And I got pissed, because I'm like, I'm not lying, and I just gave you all of this. Would you look at the information that I gave you? And he looked at it long enough to come back and be like, okay, well, I agree it's genuine EVP, but it can't, leave me alone, basically. He got really mad, and I got mad. And I don't think I'll be talking to that researcher again. But he wasn't the only person that was telling me this. The other people were going, something really unusual seems to be happening here, because with the EVP work, people will get very, very short phrases. Now, Alexander McCrae, who is a researcher that I have done a little bit of work with, I'll mention his name. Communication over email. It's not like we teamed up in a lab or did anything like that. Don't let me misrepresent what was going on here, but I reached out to him and he was very kind. And we had a back and forth, and he gave me a lot of information on, here's how you can test these things, and you can, try and validate this and whatever. And his own research says that one of the defining characteristics of an EVP is that they're only 2 to 3 seconds in length. Well, mine are 20 to 30 minutes of nonstop content. Spirits, could you please help me get in touch with Ralph and/or Carlene? I am trying to get messages from them for me. She would like to hear anything they have to say. Thank you to all of the spirits for helping assist here, and I will be in touch again soon. Occasions I got really sick. I think my immune system just plummeted. I don't know. And that got better over time, but it really was like taking something out of me, and I don't know what's going on there. I mean, there's no good information out there on this. But I do know that my results were aberrant, and that was happening over and over again. Like, I'm doing the mediumship. Oh, and that's the next thing. All right. So, mediumship. That's where this led. So I was talking to my ex on the phone about how I was getting this information. I tried the session once, and it was weird, and then I went to try it again, and I asked for a name, and I got my mom's name. First name, middle name, and then I was like, nope, I'm done. I'm out. Because the idea that I was talking potentially to a spirit scared me, honestly, even though that was kind of how all this started. I was trying to play around, I'd listened to Leslie Kean's book, Surviving Death, and I started like trying to talk to spirits and seemingly got some results, but they were so ambiguous that it was easy to just kind of, be like, oh, that's interesting, but I blew it off. But I didn't want to suddenly find out that spirits were talking to me all the time. And so I, once again, noped out of it. So I was explaining this to my friend, and she was like, wouldn't it be interesting if you could get messages from my mom? Because her mom had passed away a few years before. And I was like, I don't know how there's any way I could get any information about you that you would know and she would know that I wouldn't know. And then immediately afterwards, I went, did you have like a stuffed animal toy that kind of looks like a Snoopy doll when you were a kid and it's really tattered? And she paused and she was like, yeah. And she ended up sending me the photo. Here it is. And what she told me was, she said, she had a not great relationship with her mom. And she told me her mom didn't know a lot about her. Like, she didn't ask her a lot of questions about her. But one of the few things that would have been significant to both her and her deceased mother was the Snoopy doll. And that if her mom was trying to get me a message, because at this point I was getting stuff clairvoyantly, I was seeing it, not hearing it so much. If she was trying to get a message, that would be a perfect thing to pick. But it was still ambiguous. I was like, well, that's interesting for sure. Like so much of the rest of this, it's interesting, but it's not proof of anything. But these incidents continued to happen, and they got more and more specific. At another point, I tried to contact my friend's grandmother, and I got some messages, but then I got some other stuff. I tried to interrogate for my friend's grandmother and get something, and I got an image of a car. And I told her, I was like, it's kind of like a 67, Ford Fairlane or whatever. And I don't know anything about cars. I have no idea where this information came from. But it was what popped into my head. And I Googled, what does that car look like? And I was like, oh, yeah, that kind of looks like the car. I guess maybe I knew what that car looked like, subconsciously. And so I sent it to her. She said, no, that doesn't look familiar. She said, my mom had one of these cars. She sent that to me, and I was like, no, that's not what I saw. It's also an old car, but no, that's definitely not what I saw. And she's like, well, let me ask my family. And so she asked, her other relatives, and they came back and they said, no, you had it wrong. She had this car. And she sent me a picture of that car, and I went, that looks almost identical to the first image that I got. Even the color was very similar. And if you want to then talk about a synchronicity, shortly after we had that conversation, I was watching Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul, and the car appeared, and it was the same car. It was literally the car from the photo that she had, or that I had found when I Googled it, like the same car. Just a, coincidence, synchronicity, whatever you want to call it. And so these things continued to happen, and they got more and more specific. They would happen with random strangers on Twitter, and I would just get this urge to, say something to them. And one of them, this guy was talking about his friend Joe, and was like, hey Joe, you got any messages for this guy? And he got a picture of a dachshund, and it was like I heard wiener dog. Like, didn't hear. It was not clairaudience. It was claircognizance. It was like a knowing. It was just in my head, wiener dog. And so I said that to him. Like, I don't know, does this, like, your friend Joe said wiener dog, does that mean anything to you? And at first he was like, no. And then he went, well, actually, yeah, we just got a dog. Just adopted a dog. And it's a dachshund. It's a wiener dog. And come to think of it, my friend would have specifically called it a wiener dog because that's his sense of humor. He would have thought that was funny. And I was like, wow, that's okay. Like, still don't know how to process this because he's looking for something significant. And he picked a wiener dog. It's hard to say, but these kinds of things kept happening over and over and over and over, and they were getting more specific to the point where this guy's mother was rushed to the hospital, and I got a message from her indicating at first that I told him, here's what I'm seeing. She's had a stroke. It's on this side of her brain. I said her spirit is near her body, and she's confused. And I'm confused because I didn't really have belief in this stuff, but I'm just communicating to him what I'm seeing. And he said, yeah, she did have a stroke. And he's like, but it affected the other side of her body, which would make sense because, if you have a stroke on the left side of your body or on the left side of your brain, it affects the right side of your body. So it turned out that information was accurate. And then she passed away shortly after. And I told him some other message that I got, which involved seeing a flowering tree in a pot. Like it was a tree, but it was in a pot. Which again, I knew from like doing the remote viewing stuff, even though it doesn't make sense, just go with it, and I communicated that to him. And he said, yeah, as a matter of fact, there are 2 of these, and they were very, very important to his mom, and that she had left them to him and his brother. They each were to get one of these flowering trees. And he told me this is what the thing is called, and I Googled it, and I was like, that's exactly what I saw in my head. And they were potted. They were young enough that they were in a pot. And I've had more incidents since then that have just been more and more specific. And that coupled with the EVP, I had to accept that there is some evidence that I have mediumistic ability. But not all the time. If I try and do it intentionally, often people will say that doesn't really mean anything to me. But when it is like communicated to me and I pass it along, it tends to be 100% accurate in terms of the other person finding it deeply significant. And that was always ultimately how I evaluated it, was I asked the person, does this feel significant to you? Not, is this true? That wasn't important to me. It was, is this significant to you? And they would always say, when I got it right, yes, that is deeply significant. Not just that it was a thing that's true, but that it really genuinely felt like this was a communication from this person to them because it was one of the only things that they would identify with or whatever. So at this point, I'm like, all right, well, I've got remote viewing abilities. I've got some level of precognition. I don't have that photo of that, but there was a precognitive dream that had happened. The Psi incidents had been going on. Mediumship was happening. And I'm like, I don't understand my reality. I started to have a nervous breakdown. And I went to my therapist and my psychiatrist, and I was like, I need you guys to, like, there's got to be a test, like a sanity test. I need to take that, please, because I think I'm losing my mind. Because these things are not, people don't go through all of these things. This doesn't happen to people. All they could tell me was they were like, I don't know, I don't understand what this is, but you're not exhibiting signs of like being delusional or psychotic or anything else. You don't have any of the other indicators. You're talking coherently. You're not jumping from thought to thought. You're under a huge amount of stress, clearly, but you don't appear to be suffering from like psychosis. Then what happened is that a friend of mine who knew I was really into UFOs said, "Hey, do you remember Stuart Davis?" Now, this friend of mine was a Stuart Davis fanboy, so to speak. I mean, he's like a 60-year-old man, but he's really into Stuart Davis, likes his music a lot. He went through a Stuart period, we'll put it that way. And he had encouraged my, at the time, wife and I to go to a Stuart Davis concert. And we really enjoyed it. We had like front row seats. It was acoustic, you know. He was playing the guitar, singing his songs. Afterwards, we were both like, man, that guy is like super charismatic. He's just amazing. But, you know, I bought like one of his albums, and then, you know, my life kind of fell apart and divorce and blah, 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 and I forgot all about it. And so my friend was like, "Do you remember Stuart Davis?" "Sure I do." And he goes, "Well, Stuart's got a podcast about UFOs. You should listen to it." I was like, why on earth would Stuart Davis have a podcast about UFOs? And so I picked one of the episodes at random, and I listened to it, and it was an interview with somebody who thought they'd been abducted by aliens, and I was like, okay, that's all just pretty weird. And so my friend, later, he was like, you know, "Did you listen?" And I went, "Oh, yeah, actually, I did. That was really weird." My friend said, "Well, did you listen to the first episode?" And I went, "No." "Why?" And he said, "Well, that's the one you've got to listen to. You have to listen to the first episode." So I went back and I listened to it. Now, Stuart's podcast is called Aliens and Artists. And the whole theme of it was that he interviewed people who had had some sort of contact experience and also were artists. Because he ended up, that was his area of fascination. And boy, this is unreasonably stressful. I listened to the first episode. The title of it is Man Meets Mantis. And what Stuart described was that when he was sick, he had a fever. He intentionally meditated while he had a high fever. Had a conscious, awake vision of like an 8-foot-tall praying mantis wearing a purple high-collared robe at the foot of his bed that downloaded information into his brain and then had a short conversation with him and told him, if I remember correctly, remember who you are, or remember who you work for. I can't remember exactly which, and then disappeared. And Stuart was describing this, and I was like, I've never heard of such a thing, like a giant praying mantis. And he was talking about mantis aliens being a thing. And so I, took my phone and Googled mantis alien, and had to scroll a little bit, and then I found a drawing that somebody had done of a mantis alien or mantis being, and my stomach fell because I immediately went, oh my God, I saw one of these things when I was 6 years old.